Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Edmund Husserl, the rigorous philosopher of pure consciousness. Together and apart, they map the territories of human experience from opposite shores, one diving beneath the surface to find ancient symbols, the other suspending all assumptions to see the structures of awareness itself. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approached the inner life, one seeing mythic forces and symbolic patterns threading through the unconscious, the other discovering the essential structures of lived experience through disciplined description. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Husserl as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the late 1800s, as Europe prepared to step into a new century, two children were born into worlds separated by geography, but united by the common inheritance of German-speaking culture. Edmund Husserl entered the world on April 8th, 1859, in the Moravian town of Prosnitz, now part of the Czech Republic. Carl Gustav Jung arrived 16 years later, on July 26, 1875, in the Swiss village of Keswil on Lake Constance. Neither could have known that their intellectual paths, though never directly crossing, would trace parallel lines through the landscape of human understanding, creating between them a space where philosophy and psychology would meet, diverge, and illuminate each other's boundaries. Husserl's childhood unfolded in the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in a Jewish family that valued education and intellectual rigor. His father, Adolf Abraham Husserl, was a merchant, and young Edmund grew up surrounded by the practical concerns of business, but also the wider currents of European thought that flowed through Moravian towns. These were places where cultures mingled, where German, Czech, and Jewish traditions braided together, creating an atmosphere of cosmopolitan exchange. From his earliest years, Husserl demonstrated a remarkable capacity for concentration, an ability to withdraw into himself and contemplate problems with unwavering focus. This quality, which might have seemed like mere studiousness in a boy, would later become the foundation of an entire philosophical method. In his youth, Husserl's interests turned toward mathematics and astronomy, those disciplines that seemed to offer certainty in a changing world. He studied at the universities of Leipzig, Berlin, and Vienna, learning mathematics from the great Karl Weierstrass, whose rigorous approach to analysis left an indelible mark on the young student's mind. There was something appealing to Husserl about mathematics, about the way it revealed eternal truths through careful reasoning, about how it seemed to transcend the messy particulars of everyday life and touch something absolute. But even as he completed his doctorate in mathematics in 1883, writing on the calculus of variations, something in him remained unsatisfied. Mathematics offered certainty, yes, but what was the foundation of that certainty? How could abstract numbers and formulas claim to be true? What was the relationship between the mind thinking these thoughts and the truths themselves. These questions led Husserl to philosophy, particularly to the lectures of Franz Brentano in Vienna. Brentano was exploring what he called descriptive psychology, examining the phenomena of consciousness with scientific precision. It was Brentano who introduced Husserl to the concept of intentionality, the idea that consciousness is always consciousness of something, always directed toward an object. This seemingly simple observation would become the cornerstone of everything Husserl would build. Under Brentano's influence, Husserl began to see that before you could ask metaphysical questions about what exists, you needed to understand how things appear to consciousness, how experience itself is structured. Philosophy, he came to believe, needed to become a rigorous science, as precise and certain as mathematics, but focused on the one realm where certainty was actually possible, the realm of pure experience as it presents itself to awareness. Meanwhile, far to the west in Switzerland, Carl Jung was growing up in a very different atmosphere, where Husserl's childhood was marked by intellectual clarity and the promise of rational progress. Jung's early years were shadowed by mystery, loneliness, and the presence of forces that seemed to exceed rational explanation. His father, Paul Jung, was a Protestant pastor, but one whose faith had become hollow, worn away by doubt, until only the external forms remained. His mother, Emily, was a more complex figure, prone to strange moods and nocturnal disturbances. Young Carl felt as though she were two people, a conventional housewife by day and something darker, more uncanny by night. These early encounters with the divided nature of personality would shape everything Jung would later theorize about the human psyche. Jung's childhood was punctuated by visions and dreams that felt more real than waking life. He dreamed of a subterranean temple where a massive, fleshy pillar rose toward the ceiling, and a voice whispered that this was the man-eater. He carved a little man out of wood and hid it in the attic with a painted stone, performing secret rituals that seemed to come from some ancient part of himself he didn't understand. Where Husserl was learning to focus consciousness with mathematical precision, Jung was learning that consciousness was not the whole story, that beneath the daylight world of rational thought lay depths that contained their own forms of knowledge, their own languages spoken in symbol and image. Jung's path led him to medicine and then to psychiatry, a field that at the turn of the century was still struggling to establish itself as a legitimate science. He began his career in 1900 at the Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich under the pioneering psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler. Here, Jung worked with patients suffering from what was then called dementia praecox, later to be known as schizophrenia. He listened to their seemingly nonsensical speech and looked for patterns in their delusions. Where others saw only chaos, Jung began to perceive something else. These patients were speaking a symbolic language. Their symptoms were meaningful. They were expressing something that could not be spoken in ordinary words. This insight that the irrational had its own rationality, that madness contained a kind of method, would become central to his analytical psychology. During these same years, Husserl was developing his phenomenological method. In 1901, he published The Logical Investigations, a massive 2-volume work that challenged the prevailing psychological theories of his time. Psychologists had been trying to explain logical and mathematical truths by studying the psychological processes of thinking. Husserl saw this as a fundamental error, what he called psychologism. The truth that 2 plus 2 equals 4 doesn't depend on anyone's mental states. It's not a psychological fact, but an ideal truth. This distinction led him to articulate a new approach: phenomenology, the study of phenomena as they appear to consciousness, bracketing all assumptions about whether these phenomena correspond to an external reality or can be explained by psychological causes. Husserl's method involved what he called the epoche, or phenomenological reduction. This was a disciplined suspension of the natural attitude, the ordinary assumption that the world exists independently and that our perceptions give us access to it. By bracketing these assumptions, by putting them in parentheses without denying or affirming them, the phenomenologist could focus purely on how things appear, on the essential structures of experience itself. It was a radical move, turning away from the external world to examine the very structure of consciousness that makes any knowledge of that world possible. In a sense, Husserl was proposing that philosophy should become introspective in a new way, not examining personal psychological states, but uncovering the universal structures that make experience possible. There is a beautiful precision in Husserl's writings from this period, a sense that every word has been chosen with mathematical care. He was convinced that philosophy had gone astray by being too loose, too speculative, too willing to make grand claims without establishing a secure foundation. Phenomenology would be that foundation, a way of describing with absolute rigor what is given in experience before any theories are constructed. Reading Husserl is like watching someone build a cathedral with extraordinary patience, placing each stone with such care that the structure becomes simultaneously complex and crystalline. Jung, on the other hand, was moving in what seemed like the opposite direction. Where Husserl was bracketing and suspending, Jung was expanding and amplifying. His work with word association tests in the early 1900s revealed what he called feeling-toned complexes, clusters of emotionally charged ideas that seemed to have a life of their own within the psyche. When a patient hesitated or responded oddly to a particular word, Jung understood this as evidence of a complex interfering with conscious intention. The psyche, he was discovering, was not a unified field but a plurality, containing multiple centers of energy and meaning that could work with or against each other. In 1907, Jung began his fateful correspondence with Sigmund Freud, and for several years, the two men engaged in an intense collaboration. Jung traveled to Vienna, and Freud came to see in the younger man a kind of crown prince who would carry forward the psychoanalytic movement. But even during this period of alliance, Jung's thinking was diverging from Freud's in ways that would eventually lead to their dramatic break, where Freud saw the unconscious as primarily personal, containing repressed wishes and traumatic memories. Jung was beginning to perceive something else, a layer of the psyche that seemed to be transpersonal, collective, filled with images and patterns that appeared across cultures and throughout history. These two trajectories, Husserl's toward ever greater philosophical rigor and Jung's toward the mythic depths of the unconscious, were developing in the same cultural moment, but in almost complete isolation from each other. There is no evidence that Jung carefully read Husserl, and certainly Husserl, who had little patience for psychoanalysis, would not have been drawn to Jung's increasingly mystical explorations. Yet both men were responding to a crisis in European thought, a sense that the confident materialism and rationalism of the 19th century had failed to account for the fullness of human experience. By 1913, both men were undergoing profound transformations. Jung's relationship with Freud collapsed that year, leading Jung into what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense inner turmoil where he experienced visions and voices that brought him to the edge of madness. Rather than turn away from these experiences or try to suppress them, Jung chose to engage with them, recording his visions in what would eventually become the Red Book, an illuminated manuscript that reads like a Gnostic gospel produced by a modern mind. He conversed with figures who appeared to him, most notably Philemon, an old man with the wings of a kingfisher who seemed to possess knowledge Jung did not consciously have. These were not hallucinations to be dismissed, Jung felt, but genuine encounters with autonomous aspects of the psyche, representatives of what he was beginning to call the collective unconscious. Husserl, meanwhile, was refining his phenomenological method in response to criticisms and his own evolving understanding. His book, Ideas Pertaining to a Pure Phenomenology and to a Phenomenological Philosophy, published in 1913, presented phenomenology in its most mature form. Here, Husserl articulated the concept of the transcendental ego, the pure consciousness that remains after all empirical content has been bracketed. This was not the personal self with its history and characteristics, but the formal structure of subjectivity itself, the I that accompanies all experiences. It was an abstract concept, perhaps, but for Husserl it was the key to philosophical certainty. By examining this pure consciousness, phenomenology could describe the essential structures that make any experience possible, structures that were universal and necessary rather than contingent and personal. The First World War erupted in 1914, shattering the comfortable certainties of European culture. Both Jung and Husserl lived through this cataclysm, though their responses differed significantly. Jung, who had earlier had a vision of a monstrous flood drowning all of Europe, felt that his personal crisis had been a premonition of the collective crisis now unfolding. The war seemed to confirm his growing conviction that powerful unconscious forces could overwhelm conscious rationality, that civilized restraint was a thin veneer over darker impulses. He began to think in terms of archetypes, primordial patterns of human experience that manifested in myths, dreams, and collective movements. The war gods of ancient peoples had not disappeared, Jung believed. They had merely gone underground into the collective unconscious, from where they could erupt with renewed violence. Husserl's response to the war was different, but equally profound. He saw in the crisis of European culture a crisis of reason itself. Modern science had achieved tremendous practical success, but it had also led to a kind of spiritual emptiness, what he would later call the crisis of European sciences. Science had become merely technical, forgetting its origins in the life world, the everyday world of lived experience. In a series of lectures given in Vienna and Prague in 1935, published posthumously as The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, Husserl argued that philosophy needed to return to the life world, to recover the lived meanings that scientific abstraction had forgotten. It was a call for philosophy to remember its human origins and purposes. But we are moving too quickly. Let us return to the formative years when both men were establishing their distinctive approaches. Let us linger in the atmosphere of their early work, feeling the texture of their thinking, understanding how each man's method emerged from his particular way of being in the world. Husserl's genius lay in his ability to make consciousness itself thematic, to turn awareness back upon itself without falling into infinite regress or empty abstraction. Consider how difficult this is. When you try to examine your own consciousness, you typically end up examining the contents of consciousness, the things you're aware of. Husserl wanted something different, to study the structure of awareness itself, the formal features of how anything can appear to consciousness at all. He developed elaborate techniques for this, procedures that his students would practice like spiritual exercises. You begin by focusing on a particular experience, say, the perception of a red apple. You notice not just the apple, but how it appears to you, from a particular perspective, with one side visible and other sides implied, with a certain horizon of possible further experiences surrounding it. The apple is given as a transcendent object, something that exceeds any single perception of it. Yet it's given precisely through these partial, perspectival appearances. This kind of analysis reveals what Husserl called essential structures. The fact that physical objects are always given perspectively, that you never see all sides at once, is not a limitation of your particular consciousness, but an essential feature of how physical objects can appear at all. Through a process Husserl called eidetic variation, you could imagine the example changing in various ways, and certain features would prove to be variable, while others remained constant. Those constant features were the essences, the invariant structures that define what something is. This was not mystical intuition in the ordinary sense, but a rigorous method of thought experiment and systematic description. There is something beautiful in Husserl's commitment to this work, in his conviction that patient description could yield philosophical truth. He wrote constantly, filling thousands of pages with shorthand notes, circling around the same problems from different angles, never satisfied that he had achieved complete clarity. His students sometimes found him exhausting, as he would revise and reconsider, start again from a new perspective, question conclusions he had seemed to establish. But this restlessness was not indecisiveness. It was fidelity to the phenomena themselves, a refusal to settle for formulations that didn't quite capture the fullness of experience. Jung's approach could hardly have been more different. Where Husserl practiced a kind of philosophical asceticism, stripping away assumption after assumption to reach the pure structures of consciousness, Jung was additive and expansive, gathering images, myths, symbols, and parallels from every culture and era. His method was what he called amplification, surrounding a dream image or symptom with mythological and cultural associations until its meaning began to emerge. If a patient dreamed of a snake, Jung would not just ask about the patient's personal associations to snakes, though he would do that too. He would also bring in the snake as symbol, the snake in the Garden of Eden, the serpent of wisdom in Gnosticism, the Kundalini serpent in Hindu thought, the Ouroboros eating its own tail, the medical caduceus, the snake as renewing itself through shedding its skin. By seeing how the symbol had functioned across human cultures, Jung believed you could approach its archetypal meaning, its root significance in the collective unconscious. This method infuriated critics who saw it as anything but rigorous. How could you claim to be doing science when you were mixing dream analysis with mythology and alchemy? How could such free association lead to knowledge rather than fantasy? But Jung insisted that the psyche itself speaks in this mythological language, that symbols are not arbitrary but meaningful, pointing towards something real in the structure of the unconscious. A dream about a snake was not just about snakes, but about transformation, danger, healing, wisdom, all the meanings that human beings have consistently discovered in that image. The psyche, Jung believed, was inherently symbolic, and to understand it required learning its symbolic language. There is a story Jung tells about a patient, a young woman whose dreams contained images of immense cosmic significance. world creation, apocalypse, divine hierogamy. Jung recognized these as archetypal images, but he was puzzled because the woman herself seemed quite ordinary, not particularly philosophical or spiritual. The dreams persisted, growing more numinous and overwhelming. Then Jung learned that the woman was suffering from a terminal illness. She died a few months later. Looking back, Jung understood that her unconscious had known what her conscious mind did not, that she was approaching death, and it had been preparing her through these grand mythological images, situating her personal ending within a cosmic context. This was the kind of phenomenon Jung specialized in. The unconscious as a knowing subject, as possessing its own wisdom, as capable of compensating for the one-sidedness of consciousness. Could Husserl's phenomenology have made sense of such an event? It's difficult to imagine. Husserl's method bracketed questions about the unconscious, about hidden meanings, about symbolic interpretations. His focus was on what is given in consciousness, on the structures of appearance themselves. He would have resisted Jung's amplification method as importing theoretical assumptions into what should be pure description. If Husserl examined a dream, he would ask, what is the essential structure of dreaming as a mode of consciousness? How does dream consciousness differ from waking perception? What are the formal features that make something a dream rather than a memory or a fantasy? These are legitimate questions, but they move in a different dimension from Jung's concern with the dream's meaning, its message, its compensatory function within the economy of the psyche. Yet both men, in their different ways, were trying to take subjective experience seriously, to treat it not as a secondary reflection of physical reality, but as worthy of study in its own right. This was not obvious in their era. The dominant trends in both philosophy and psychology were naturalistic and reductionistic, trying to explain consciousness in terms of brain states, conditioning, evolutionary adaptation. Husserl and Jung, from their different positions, both insisted that subjective experience had its own integrity, its own structures and meanings that could not be reduced to something else. As the 1920s unfolded, both men were consolidating their positions and training students. Husserl taught at the University of Freiburg from 1916 until his retirement in 1928. His lectures attracted serious students who were drawn to the rigor and radicality of phenomenology. Among them was Martin Heidegger, who would eventually succeed Husserl to the chair at Freiburg and then, to Husserl's deep disappointment, take phenomenology in a new direction toward existential analysis and the question of being. Husserl felt that Heidegger had abandoned the careful descriptive work of phenomenology for speculative metaphysics. The relationship between teacher and student deteriorated, and the situation was compounded by the rise of National Socialism. Heidegger joined the Nazi Party in 1933, and Husserl, who was Jewish, found himself increasingly isolated in the final years of his life. Jung, meanwhile, was establishing himself in Zurich as a private practitioner and theorist. His break with Freud had freed him to develop his own psychology, though it also left him somewhat isolated from the mainstream psychoanalytic movement. He wrote prolifically through the 20s and 30s. Psychological Types in 1921, which introduced the concepts of extroversion and introversion and outlined Jung's theory of psychological functions. Studies on the relationship between psychology and religion, explorations of alchemy as a symbolic system parallel to his own psychology. He traveled to Africa, to New Mexico to visit the Pueblo Indians, to India, seeking encounters with cultures where the symbolic dimension of life remained more conscious than in rationalized Europe. Jung's writings from this period show him developing the core concepts of analytical psychology, the collective unconscious, archetypes, the process of individuation. The collective unconscious, he proposed, was a deeper layer of the psyche beneath the personal unconscious that Freud had explored. It contained not memories from an individual's life, but the inherited forms of psychic functioning, patterns that shaped how humans everywhere experienced and imagined the world. These patterns, the archetypes, manifested in myths, dreams, visions, and symptoms. There was the great mother archetype, appearing as the nurturing goddess or the devouring witch, the wise old man as guide, end quote. Teacher, the shadow, containing everything the conscious ego rejected and disowned, the self, the archetype of wholeness and totality. These were not just interesting patterns, but forces, autonomous complexes that could possess consciousness and drive behavior. Individuation, Jung's term for psychological development, was the process of becoming conscious of these archetypal forces and integrating them into a more complete personality. It was not about perfection or achieving some ideal state, but about becoming more fully yourself, acknowledging and incorporating the contradictions and multiplicities within the psyche. It required encountering the shadow, accepting the rejected parts of yourself. It involved differentiating from collective identifications, becoming less bound by what Jung called participation mystique with family, nation, or mass movements. It meant developing a relationship with the self, that mysterious center that was more than the ego, that seemed to guide the personality from a deeper wisdom. This sounds quite mystical, and indeed, Jung's psychology was increasingly taking on spiritual dimensions. He wrote about the individuation process in terms that echoed religious initiation, spiritual journey, alchemical transformation. His critics accused him of abandoning science for mysticism, of mixing empiricism with metaphysics in a confused and confusing way. Jung's response was that he was describing what he actually observed in his patients and in his own experience. People's dreams did contain mythological themes. The psyche did seem to be organized around these recurring patterns. If this made psychology sound religious, perhaps that was because religion had always been dealing with psychological realities, just in symbolic language. Here we reach one of the fundamental divides between Jung and Husserl. Husserl believed that phenomenology must strictly separate the psychological from the philosophical. He had begun with descriptive psychology in his early work, but he came to see that you cannot ground philosophy in empirical psychology, because empirical facts are contingent. Today's psychological findings might be overturned by tomorrow's research. Philosophy needs necessary truths, essential structures that hold for any possible consciousness. So Husserl moved from psychology to transcendental phenomenology, which examined not this or that empirical consciousness, but the formal structures that make consciousness as such possible. Jung, conversely, while he sometimes aspired to being philosophical, was fundamentally engaged with the empirical psyche in all its particularities and particularities. He dealt with actual patients, actual dreams, actual symptoms. His theorizing emerged from and returned to this clinical soil. When he wrote about archetypes, he supported his claims with dream examples, mythological parallels, cross-cultural comparisons. It was an empirical psychology, even if it was dealing with symbolic and imaginal material that resisted standard scientific method. This difference in method reflects a difference in concern. Husserl wanted to secure the foundations of knowledge itself, to establish philosophy as a rigorous science. His question was epistemological. How is knowledge possible? What are the conditions of possibility for truth? Jung wanted to understand the human soul in its fullness, to develop a psychology that could help people live more meaningfully. His question was therapeutic and existential. How can a person become whole? What does the psyche need for health and development? These are not incompatible questions, but they pull in different directions. Husserl's phenomenology tends toward the universal and essential, toward what is necessary and invariant. Jung's psychology is drawn toward the particular and meaningful, toward what speaks to this person in this situation. Husserl brackets questions of personal meaning to focus on formal structures. Jung embraces questions of meaning as central to psychological health. Consider their different relationships to imagination. For Husserl, imagination plays a crucial methodological role in phenomenology. Through what he calls free variation in imagination, the phenomenologist can test which features of an experience are essential and which are accidental. You imagine different versions of the experience, changing one feature after another, until you isolate what cannot be changed without the thing ceasing to be what it is. Imagination here is a tool for discovering essences, a way of running thought experiments to reveal necessary structures. But Husserl was also wary of imagination. He distinguished sharply between perception, which gives us the things themselves, and imagination or fantasy, which only gives us images. Perception has a character of presence and reality that imagination lacks. The task of phenomenology is to describe things as they give themselves, and imagination, if not carefully controlled, can lead us away from the phenomena into arbitrary constructions. Husserl wanted to see clearly, and imagination, he felt, could cloud as much as clarify. Jung's attitude toward imagination could not be more different. For him, imagination is not secondary to perception, but potentially more revealing. The imaginal realm, what Jung called the mundus imaginalis, following Henry Corbin's work on Islamic mysticism, was where the psyche showed its true nature, in what Jung called active imagination. A person would engage with the figures and scenarios that arose spontaneously from the unconscious, not just passively observing them, but interacting with them, asking questions, receiving answers. This was not fantasy in the sense of arbitrary make-believe, but a disciplined encounter with the autonomous contents of the psyche. The images that arose had their own consistency, their own logic. They taught things that the conscious ego did not already know. During his confrontation with the unconscious, Jung practiced active imagination intensively. He would enter a kind of waking dream state and find himself in imaginal landscapes, meeting figures like Philemon or the anima figure Salome. These encounters felt absolutely real to him, more real in some ways than ordinary perception, because they put him in touch with parts of himself, or perhaps parts of the collective psyche, that were otherwise inaccessible. Jung came to believe that active imagination was not just a therapeutic technique, but a way of relating to the unconscious that had been practiced throughout history by mystics, shamans, and alchemists, though in different forms. Husserl would likely have regarded active imagination with deep suspicion. It seems to violate every phenomenological scruple. How can you claim to be observing consciousness rigorously when you're deliberately entering altered states? How can you distinguish genuine insight from self-induced fantasy? How can you tell whether Philemon represents a real aspect of the psyche or is merely a projection of your own thoughts? These objections point to a real methodological gulf. Husserl's phenomenology requires a kind of sobriety, a discipline of clear awareness that brackets imagination's more wild and creative aspects. Jung's analytical psychology requires a kind of openness to the imagination's autonomous productions, a willingness to be surprised by what emerges. Yet might there be a hidden connection here? Both men are asking us to attend carefully to subjective experience, but they're attending to different layers of that experience. Husserl attends to the formal structures of intentionality, the ways consciousness is always directed toward objects, the horizons and profiles through which things appear. Jung attends to the symbolic contents that arise from the unconscious, the images and narratives that seem to come from beyond the ego's control. Husserl is interested in the how of experience, the modes and manners of givenness. Jung is interested in the what that appears, especially when what appears has a numinous, autonomous quality. Both methods require a particular kind of attention, a tuning of consciousness that goes against the grain of everyday distraction. Husserl's student Eugen Fink described phenomenological reduction as a kind of epoche, a suspension of participation in the natural attitude. You step back from your ordinary immersion in the world and observe instead how the world appears, how it is constituted for consciousness. This stepping back requires practice and discipline. It's not easy to suspend the natural attitude, to stop taking the world for granted and instead examine how it shows itself. Jung's approach also requires a stepping back, but in a different direction. You don't step back from the world to observe consciousness. You step back from ego consciousness to observe what arises from the unconscious. You create a space of inner attention where images can appear, and you cultivate an attitude of respectful curiosity toward them. You don't impose your conscious will on the images, trying to make them mean what you want them to mean. You let them speak, reveal themselves, surprise you. This also requires practice and courage, because you don't know what will emerge, and the contents of the unconscious can be disturbing, overwhelming. In both cases, there's a move from the natural attitude to a reflective attitude, from being absorbed in immediate concerns to observing the structures or contents of psychic life. Both methods are phenomenological in a broad sense. They're attending to phenomena as they appear, rather than trying to explain them away or reduce them to something else. But Husserl's phenomenology is eidetic and structural, seeking universal essences, while Jung's approach is hermeneutic and symbolic, seeking individual and collective meanings. Let us explore their different concepts more carefully, holding them side by side to see where they touch and where they diverge. Start with intentionality, Husserl's master concept. Consciousness, he insists, is always consciousness of something. You cannot just be conscious. You must be conscious of some object, even if that object is your own mental state or an imaginary unicorn. This ofness, this directedness toward an object, is the defining feature of consciousness. The object is constituted through various intentional acts: perceiving, remembering, imagining, judging, evaluating, desiring. Each kind of act has its own structure, its own way of giving the object. When you perceive a tree, the tree is given as present, as really there before you, even though you only see one side of it. When you remember the tree, it's given as past, as no longer present, but as having been present. When you imagine a tree, it's given as unreal, as a mere image without claiming actual existence. same object, but given through different, intentional acts with different modes of givenness. Husserl spends hundreds of pages analyzing these differences, showing how consciousness constitutes its world through these various intentional structures. Now consider Jung's concept of libido, which he understood differently from Freud. For Freud, libido was specifically sexual energy. For Jung, libido was psychic energy in general, the life force that invested objects with value and significance. Libido could attach to outer objects or to inner images. When libido was invested in the external world, you were oriented outward, engaged with people and things. When libido withdrew from the external world, it didn't disappear. It went inward, activating contents of the unconscious. This is what happened in depression or introversion. Libido retreated from outer engagement and animated inner images, fantasies, memories. The movement of libido followed what Jung called a symbolic process. Libido didn't just flow mechanically, according to pleasure and pain, as Freud suggested. It organized itself according to meaningful patterns, the archetypes. When libido constellated an archetype, that archetype would come alive in consciousness, appearing in dreams or projections or sudden interests. A man might find himself fascinated by a particular woman, not because she objectively possessed certain qualities, but because his anima, the feminine archetype in his psyche, was projected onto her. She carried the numinous charge of the archetype, which is why the attraction felt so powerful beyond rational explanation. Here we have two different ways of understanding consciousness's relationship to its objects. For Husserl, consciousness is always already directed toward objects through its intentional structure. The directedness is primary, and the task of phenomenology is to describe the various modes of this directedness. For Jung, psychic energy invests objects with significance according to unconscious patterns. The object carries a charge, and the task of psychology is to understand why this particular object, at this particular time, has become meaningful. Husserl might say that Jung is confusing phenomenological description with causal explanatory theory. When you describe your experience of being attracted to someone, you can note the features of the attraction, how the person appears fascinating, how your attention keeps returning to them, how they seem to possess special qualities. That's phenomenological description. But when you explain this by saying that you're projecting your anima onto them, you're going beyond what's given in the experience itself. You're importing a theoretical construct, the anima, to explain something that should simply be described. Jung might respond that pure description is never enough when dealing with the psyche. Yes, you can describe the phenomenology of attraction, but if you stop there, you miss what the attraction means, what it's trying to accomplish in the economy of the psyche. The anima projection is not just a theoretical construct. It's a living reality that the patient will recognize if you point it out skillfully. They'll say, "Yes, that's exactly it. I'm not really seeing her as she is. I'm responding to something in myself that she represents." The interpretation doesn't distort the phenomenon. It illuminates it, makes visible what was implicit. This exchange points to a fundamental methodological difference. Husserl wants phenomenology to be presuppositionless, to describe what is given without importing theoretical assumptions. Jung believes that what is given in consciousness is always already meaningful, already interpreted by unconscious processes, and the therapist's job is to make those unconscious interpretations conscious. For Husserl, meaning is a structure of consciousness, a way that objects are given as significant. For Jung, meaning comes from the unconscious, from archetypal patterns that precede and shape consciousness. Consider their different approaches to essence. Husserl's essences are discovered through eidetic variation. You imagine a thing changing in various ways until you find what cannot change without the thing ceasing to be what it is. The essence of a color, for instance, is extension. A color must be spread over some area, even if just a point. You can change its hue, intensity, brightness, but you cannot have a color that has no extension at all. Through such analyses, Husserl aimed to discover the essential structures of different regions of being: physical things, living beings, mental states, cultural objects. Jung's archetypes initially seem similar. They're universal patterns that appear across different cultures and individuals. The Great Mother archetype, for instance, appears as Demeter in Greek mythology, as Isis in Egyptian religion, as Mary in Christianity, as Kali in Hindu tradition. Despite the cultural differences, there's a recognizable pattern. The mother as source of life, as nurturer, as one who gives and takes away. The archetype is the pattern, not any particular manifestation of it. But Jung's archetypes are not essences in Husserl's sense. They're not formal structures discovered through eidetic analysis, but dynamic forces discovered through empirical observation of dreams, myths, and symptoms. An archetype is not just a pattern. It's a center of energy, an autonomous complex that can seize consciousness and drive behavior. When an archetype is activated, it comes with emotional charge, with numinosity, with a sense of overwhelming significance. This is not what Husserl means by essence at all. Husserl's essences are timeless, unchanging, purely formal. The essence of a physical object's mode of givenness was the same for ancient Greeks as it is for us. It's a necessary structure of how physical things can appear to any possible consciousness. Jung's archetypes, though they have a core pattern, are dynamic and evolving. They interact with each other, combine in different ways, undergo transformation through the individuation process. They have a kind of life, a developmental potential. Moreover, Husserl's essences are descriptive. They tell you what something is, how it appears, what structures define its mode of being. Jung's archetypes are interpretive. They tell you what something means, what role it plays in the psychic economy, what it's trying to accomplish. When Jung says a dream image manifests the self-archetype, he's not describing a formal structure, but interpreting the image's psychological significance. There is something tragic in the fact that these two approaches never really engaged with each other. Husserl's phenomenology could have benefited from Jung's attention to the symbolic dimension of experience, to the ways meaning emerges from depths beyond rational consciousness. Jung's analytical psychology could have benefited from Husserl's rigorous descriptive method, from his insistence on distinguishing description from interpretation, but the gulf between academic philosophy and clinical psychology was too wide. They were working in different institutions, writing for different audiences, addressing different questions. As we move into the 1930s, both men faced external challenges that inflected their work in new ways. Husserl, as a Jew in Nazi Germany, was increasingly marginalized. In 1933, he was forbidden to enter the university library or participate in university events. His students, with some exceptions, abandoned him. Heidegger, now rector of the university, did nothing to help. Husserl retreated into his work, writing intensively in his final years on the crisis of European sciences and the problem of intersubjectivity. He died in 1938, his work incomplete, leaving behind thousands of pages of unpublished manuscripts in shorthand. Jung's position in the 1930s is more controversial. He became president of the General Medical Society for Psychotherapy in 1933, and he continued to maintain professional relationships in Germany even as the Nazi regime consolidated power. He wrote articles that distinguished Jewish psychology from Aryan psychology, claims that have been subject to intense scrutiny and criticism. Jung's defenders argue that he was trying to prevent the complete Nazification of psychotherapy, that his statements were pragmatic rather than ideological, that he helped Jewish colleagues emigrate. His critics see evidence of anti-Semitism, or at least a troubling willingness to accommodate the regime. The truth is probably complex, a mixture of political naivety, personal ambition, and genuine but flawed efforts to maintain professional autonomy in a totalitarian context. But let us not allow these historical contingencies to overshadow the intellectual relationship we're exploring. The question before us is not what Jung or Husserl did or failed to do in specific political circumstances, but how their approaches to consciousness and the psyche relate to each other, what they can teach us about the territories of human inner life. One of the most profound differences between them concerns the status of the unconscious. For Husserl, the unconscious is at best a marginal concept. Phenomenology studies consciousness, what appears to awareness. If something is unconscious, truly outside awareness, then it's not a phenomenon, and thus not available for phenomenological investigation. Husserl did acknowledge what he called passive synthesis, the way consciousness is always already organized before we actively attend to it. And he explored the structure of the life world, the taken-for-granted background that makes experience possible. But he was deeply skeptical of psychoanalytic speculation about unconscious wishes and repressed memories. Such claims seemed to go beyond what could be rigorously described. For Jung, the unconscious is primary. Consciousness emerges from the unconscious like an island from the sea, and it remains surrounded and sustained by unconscious depths. Most of the psyche is unconscious, and the unconscious is not just the repository of forgotten memories or repressed wishes. It's creative, productive, purposive. The unconscious compensates for the one-sidedness of consciousness, producing dreams that balance conscious attitudes. It contains wisdom that the ego lacks, knowledge of what the personality needs for development. The unconscious is not an absence, but a presence, not just the negation of consciousness, but a positive reality with its own modes of functioning. This difference shapes everything else. Husserl believes that patient description of conscious experience can yield certain knowledge. Jung believes that interpretation of unconscious manifestations is necessary for psychological understanding. Husserl thinks imagination should be controlled and used methodologically. Jung thinks imagination should be allowed to unfold autonomously. Husserl wants clarity and distinctness. Jung wants meaning and integration. There's a passage in Jung's autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where he describes sitting by Lake Zurich, carving figures in stone. He's asking himself, what am I really doing? What is the meaning of this compulsive activity? And a voice within him says, you are creating a ritual. This recognition that his conscious actions expressed an unconscious need for ritual, for symbolic activity, transformed his understanding. He realized that modern people had lost the symbolic dimension of life, the sense that everyday actions could carry transpersonal meaning. The unconscious, through his compulsive stone carving, was trying to restore this dimension. Husserl would likely see this as interesting psychological introspection, but not as phenomenology. The voice within, interpreting the activity, is already beyond pure description. It's a theoretical understanding imposed on the experience. But for Jung, this kind of interpretation is precisely what reveals the experience's true significance. The phenomenological surface, the fact that he's carving stones, is less important than the underlying meaning, the need for ritual that the activity expresses. Now we come to one of the deepest questions. What is the relationship between individual experience and universal structures? Husserl's phenomenology aims for the universal. Through eidetic analysis, you bracket the particular features of your individual experience to grasp essential structures that hold for any consciousness. Your particular perspective doesn't matter except as an example, a starting point for discovering what's invariant. The goal is to describe consciousness as such, not this or that person's consciousness. Jung's psychology honors the universal through archetypes, but remains committed to individual uniqueness. Yes, everyone's psyche contains the same archetypal structures, but how those archetypes manifest and combine is unique to each person. The individuation process is not about conforming to a universal pattern, but about becoming who you uniquely are. Jung speaks of the self as the archetype of wholeness, but he's clear that wholeness looks different for each person. There's no formula for individuation, no prescribed path. This leads to different therapeutic stances. A phenomenological therapist, if such exists, might help a patient describe their experience more clearly, distinguish different modes of consciousness, notice structures they had taken for granted. The goal would be enhanced clarity, a more lucid relationship to one's own experiencing. A Jungian analyst helps the patient interpret symbols, understand archetypal patterns, recognize projections, withdraw identifications. The goal is integration, a more complete personality. Both approaches respect the patient's experience, but they respect it differently. Phenomenology says, your experience is valid as it is. Let's describe it carefully. Jungian analysis says, your experience is meaningful. Let's understand what it means. One emphasizes accurate description. The other emphasizes deep interpretation. Yet might these approaches be complementary rather than contradictory? Perhaps psychological understanding requires both description and interpretation, both clarity about what appears and insight into what it means. Husserl's critique of psychologism, his insistence that logical and mathematical truths are not reducible to psychological states, is important. It reminds us that not everything is psychology, that there are structures of meaning that transcend individual psyches. Jung's attention to the unconscious, to symbol and archetype, is equally important. It reminds us that rational consciousness is not the whole story, that meaning comes from depths we don't control. As we linger in this space between their approaches, certain symmetries and contrasts become visible. Both men were responding to a crisis of meaning in modern culture. Husserl saw it as an epistemological crisis. Philosophy had lost its rigor. Science had become merely technical. Reason had forgotten its grounds. Jung saw it as a psychological crisis. Modern people had lost connection with the symbolic dimension, with myth and ritual, with the unconscious sources of meaning. Both sought a return to foundations, but to different foundations. Husserl to the transcendental structures of consciousness, Jung to the archetypal structures of the collective unconscious. Both developed methods that required discipline and practice. Husserl's phenomenological reduction was not something you could do casually. It required training, patience, the ability to suspend the natural attitude and observe how things are constituted for consciousness. Jung's active imagination and amplification required similar discipline. The ability to quiet the ego's demands, attend to what arises from the unconscious, resist imposing premature interpretations. In both cases, the method was inseparable from a certain transformation of the practitioner. You couldn't practice phenomenology or analytical psychology without being changed by the practice. Both men also shared a certain relationship to tradition. Husserl saw himself as returning philosophy to its Socratic and Cartesian roots, recovering the spirit of rigorous inquiry after centuries of dogmatism and relativism. He was both radical and conservative, radical in his method, conservative in his goal of re-establishing philosophy as a rigorous science. Jung also saw himself as recovering something ancient, the symbolic wisdom of alchemy, Gnosticism, Eastern philosophy. He was bringing back what modernity had forgotten, the knowledge that the psyche is the primary reality. That inner experience is as real and important as outer achievement. Yet their attitudes toward tradition differed significantly. Husserl wanted to establish phenomenology on foundations so secure that tradition could be reconstructed rationally from the ground up. He respected the history of philosophy but felt that previous thinkers had not been rigorous enough. Everything needed to be re-examined, revalidated through phenomenological method. Jung, by contrast, treated traditional wisdom with reverence. Alchemists, Gnostics, and shamans had intuited psychological truths that modern rationalism had dismissed. Jung's task was not to replace tradition with new foundations, but to translate traditional symbolic language into modern psychological terms, showing that the ancients were describing the same psychic realities he was observing in his practice. This difference reflects their different relationships to rationality. Husserl had supreme faith in reason, provided it was rigorously applied. Through careful rational analysis of consciousness, phenomenology could achieve certainty. Jung was more ambivalent about reason. He valued rational understanding but felt it was insufficient, one-sided. The unconscious operated according to its own logic, a symbolic logic that couldn't be fully translated into rational terms. Wholeness required integrating both rational and irrational dimensions of the psyche. We can see this difference in how they approached apparent contradictions. For Husserl, contradictions signal conceptual confusion. If your analysis leads to contradictions, you need to go back and clarify your concepts, distinguish different meanings that you've conflated. Phenomenology aims for consistency, clarity, non-contradiction. For Jung, contradictions in the psyche are not errors but data. The psyche is fundamentally paradoxical, containing opposed forces that need to be held in tension rather than resolved. The self, the goal of individuation, is a union of opposites, a coincidentia oppositorum. You don't dissolve the contradiction. You live it, hold it consciously, create a third thing that transcends both poles. Consider the mandala, the circular symbol that appears in many of Jung's patients' dreams and drawings. For Jung, the mandala represented the self, wholeness, the integration of opposites within a unified structure. The mandala contains all the elements of the psyche, held together in balanced tension. It's not that conflicts are resolved in the mandala. They're composed, arranged into a harmonious pattern while retaining their distinctness. This kind of symbolic thinking is foreign to Husserl's phenomenology, which seeks conceptual precision rather than symbolic integration. Yet there is something phenomenological in Jung's attention to how symbols appear. When a patient spontaneously draws a mandala, Jung doesn't immediately interpret it. He first asks the patient to describe their experience of the image, what it evokes, how it feels. He's attending to the phenomenon as it gives itself, to the mandala's mode of appearing before he imposes interpretation. The interpretation comes after, through amplification and comparison with other mandalas from different cultures. So Jung does practice a kind of descriptive phenomenology, even if he doesn't use that language, before moving to the interpretive level. Similarly, Husserl, despite his focus on formal structures, sometimes touches on content that feels almost Jungian. In his late work on passive synthesis and genetic phenomenology, he explores how the life world is sedimented with meanings that we inherit from previous generations. There are habitual patterns of perception and understanding that precede individual experience, structures of the life world that shape how things can appear to us. This is not the same as Jung's collective unconscious, but it gestures toward a similar idea, that individual consciousness is situated within a transpersonal field of meaning that precedes and enables individual experience. The tragedy is that these two streams of thought developed in almost complete isolation from each other. Phenomenology became an academic philosophical movement, refined and elaborated by Husserl's students and their students. It influenced existentialism through Heidegger and Sartre, hermeneutics through Gadamer, and later movements like post-structuralism. Jungian psychology became a therapeutic approach, practiced by analysts who studied dreams and symbols, who helped patients individuate. The two worlds rarely met. There were some exceptions. Ludwig Binswanger, a Swiss psychiatrist who knew Jung and corresponded with Freud, tried to combine existential phenomenology with psychoanalysis, creating what he called designs analysis. He drew on Heidegger's phenomenology to develop a psychiatric approach that attended to the patient's way of being in the world. But even Binswanger remained closer to Heidegger than to Jung, more interested in existential structures than archetypal patterns. In the 1960s and 70s, some thinkers began exploring connections between phenomenology and depth psychology. Paul Ricoeur's Freud and Philosophy attempted a phenomenological reading of psychoanalysis. James Hillman, a post-Jungian theorist, developed an archetypal psychology that borrowed phenomenological language about how images appear and give themselves. But a thorough dialogue between Husserlian phenomenology and Jungian psychology has never fully materialized. Perhaps this is because the gap is genuinely difficult to bridge. Husserl's transcendental phenomenology and Jung's archetypal psychology seem to be looking in opposite directions, one toward the formal structures of consciousness, the other toward the symbolic contents of the unconscious, one toward universal essences, the other toward individual meanings, one bracketing metaphysics, the other embracing it. Yet from where we stand now, looking back at both traditions, we can see that they were mapping different regions of the same vast territory of human interiority. Imagine a conversation between them, impossible in historical fact, but possible in the realm of ideas. Husserl might begin by asking Jung, how can you claim to study the unconscious scientifically? By definition, the unconscious is not given to consciousness, not available for observation. Aren't your claims about archetypes and the collective unconscious speculative constructs rather than rigorous descriptions? Jung might respond, but the unconscious becomes conscious in symptoms, dreams, and visions. I'm not speculating about something unobservable. I'm interpreting manifestations that are observable. When a patient dreams of a mandala, that's a phenomenon, something that appears. My task is to understand what it means, to see the archetype expressing itself through the image. Husserl. But you're going beyond the phenomenon itself when you invoke archetypes. The dream image is what's given. The archetype is a theoretical construct you're using to explain the image. Phenomenology would describe the image precisely as it appears, noting its structure, its affective tone, its place in the flow of consciousness, without adding interpretive layers. Jung. But pure description is never enough with the psyche. The psyche is inherently meaningful, always saying more than appears on the surface. If I only describe the manifest content of a dream, I miss its essential nature, which is to communicate something from the unconscious to consciousness. The archetype isn't something I add to the image. It's what gives the image its power and significance. Husserl. Yet how do you validate your interpretations? If different analysts might interpret the same dream differently, aren't you in the realm of subjective opinion rather than objective knowledge? Phenomenology can achieve intersubjective validity because we're all describing the same essential structures of consciousness. Your interpretations seem to lack that rigor. Jung. But the validation comes from the patient's response. When an interpretation is right, the patient recognizes it. They say, "Yes, that resonates. That makes sense of my experience." The proof is therapeutic. The interpretation unlocks something, allows development to continue. It's not subjective opinion, but a practical truth that enables healing. Husserl. That's pragmatic validation, which is fine for therapy, but doesn't establish theoretical truth. Medicine can cure without understanding. A treatment can work without the theory behind it being correct. If you want analytical psychology to be a science, you need more rigorous foundations. But the psyche is not an object, like physical objects, that lend themselves to mathematical description. It's a subject with intentions, meanings, purposes. You can't study it with the same methods you'd use for physics or even biology. Psychology requires a hermeneutic approach, interpretation of meanings, not just causal explanation. Here Husserl might pause, recognizing something familiar. His own late work had moved toward the life world, toward the meanings that underlie scientific abstraction. He had criticized objectivistic science for forgetting the subjective origins of meaning. Perhaps there is more common ground than first appears. Husserl. I agree that meanings are fundamental. Consciousness is always meaning-bestowing. We experience a world that is always already meaningful, but we need to distinguish between describing how things are meaningful and speculating about hidden forces that produce meaning. I can describe phenomenologically how a symbol appears, what makes it symbolic, without invoking an unconscious archetype causing the symbol to appear. Jung. But the question is, what makes some symbols universal? Why the same images appear across cultures and myths and dreams? The archetype is not a hidden force, but a facely, structuring pattern, a form that shapes symbolic expression. It's like your essences, actually, the invariant structures that appear across variations. This comparison interests Husserl. Is Jung's archetype similar to his essence? Both are universal patterns that appear across particular instances. Both are discovered through examining variations and finding what remains constant. Husserl. The difference is that essences are discovered through eidetic variation, a rational method, while you claim to discover archetypes empirically through collecting examples from mythology and dreams. Essences are a priori, necessary structures. Archetypes seem to be empirical generalizations. Jung. They're not just empirical generalizations, though. The archetype itself is never directly observable, only its manifestations are. The archetype is a form without content, a potential pattern that gets filled with content differently in different cultures and individuals. In that sense, it's more like your formal structure than an empirical generalization. Husserl considers this. Jung seems to be pointing towards something that might be phenomenologically legitimate. The formal structures that make certain kinds of symbolic experience possible, but he's mixing this with causal claims about unconscious processes, which Husserl finds problematic. Husserl. Perhaps there's a way to reformulate your insights phenomenologically. Instead of saying archetypes are unconscious patterns that cause certain experiences, we could say that certain experiences have archetypal structures, ways of being given that recur universally. The mother figure, for instance, is not caused by a mother archetype in the unconscious, but is a certain way of experiencing nurture and dependence that has essential features. Jung. That would lose something essential, though. The archetype is not just a structure of experience. It's a living force, a center of energy that can seize consciousness. When someone is possessed by an archetype, it's not just that they're having a certain type of experience. They're gripped by something autonomous, something that has its own agency. But that sounds like mythology, not science. You're anthropomorphizing psychic contents, treating them as agents. Phenomenology would bracket such claims and focus on what can be rigorously described. And here we see the impasse. For Husserl, rigor means bracketing existence claims and focusing on how things appear. For Jung, the psyche's reality includes autonomous forces that cannot be reduced to structures of appearance. Jung is doing something Husserl would call metaphysics or speculative psychology. But Jung would say that this is necessarily so. The psyche itself has a metaphysical dimension, or rather, what we call metaphysical realities are actually psychological realities, archetypes experienced as gods or demons or cosmic forces. Let us try another avenue. Both men were interested in the relationship between individual and universal. Husserl sought universal structures of consciousness through transcendental phenomenology. Jung sought universal patterns of the psyche through comparative mythology and dream analysis, but they approached universality differently. For Husserl, universality is achieved through eidetic analysis. You bracket the particular empirical features of an experience and grasp its essence. What must be the case for it to be the kind of experience it is? The universal is discovered through rational intuition of essences, not through empirical generalization. For Jung, universality is discovered through comparative amplification. You gather examples of a symbol from different cultures and eras, noting recurrent patterns. The universal emerges through empirical comparison, though Jung would say it's not just an empirical generalization because the archetype has a priori reality, it exists prior to its manifestations. Husserl's method is more secure in one sense. Eidetic intuition, when properly performed, yields certainty. You see directly that this is an essential feature, not just a common one. Jung's method is more vulnerable to error. Maybe you've cherry-picked examples. Maybe the pattern you see is imposed rather than discovered. Maybe different cultures' symbols are actually different despite surface similarities. but Jung's method is richer in another sense. By gathering mythological and cultural material, Jung illuminates the manifold ways archetypes can manifest, the creativity and variability within the universal pattern. Husserl's essences are abstract and formal. Jung's archetypes are concrete and alive with cultural content. Perhaps both methods are necessary for different purposes. When you want to understand the formal structure of perception, memory, or imagination, Husserl's eidetic analysis is the right tool. When you want to understand the symbolic dimension of human experience, why certain images carry numinous power, Jung's amplification method is appropriate. The two approaches address different dimensions of the same experiential field. There's another fundamental difference we must explore: their relationships to time and history. Husserl's essences are timeless. The essential structures of consciousness are the same for ancient humans as for modern ones, the same for all possible consciousness. Phenomenology brackets historical and cultural particularities to grasp the invariant. Husserl did develop a genetic phenomenology later in his career, examining how consciousness's structures develop and sediment over time, but even this genetic account aimed for universal structures of temporal development rather than historically particular content. Jung's archetypes are also trans-historical in a sense. They're the same archetypes appearing across cultures and eras, but they evolve. The way the self-archetype manifests in modern dreams is different from its manifestation in medieval alchemy or ancient mystery religions. The archetypes adapt to cultural context, speaking in different symbolic languages to different eras. Jung was deeply interested in how consciousness itself has evolved throughout human history, from participation mystique to ego consciousness to potential individuation. This historical dimension is central to his psychology. Jung's autobiography describes a dream he had while traveling in Africa. He was in a house with multiple levels. The top floor was furnished in the style of his own time, the 19th century. As he descended, each floor was older, Rococo, medieval, Roman, and finally, a Stone Age cave. At the bottom were two skulls. Jung understood this as representing the layers of the psyche, the modern conscious ego on top, then earlier cultural layers, and finally the archaic collective unconscious at the bottom. The psyche contains history, not just as memory, but as living structure. Husserl would likely see this dream as interesting personal symbolism, but not as revealing objective truth about consciousness. The idea that the psyche has evolutionary or historical layers is a theoretical construct, not something that can be phenomenologically described. Consciousness, as such, the transcendental ego, has no history. It's the condition of possibility for history, but not itself historical. Yet Husserl's late work on the life world does acknowledge that we're always situated in a historical tradition of meanings. The world as we experience it is sedimented with interpretations from previous generations. We inherit ways of seeing, categorizing, valuing. This historical dimension can't be bracketed entirely. It's part of the structure of experience itself. In this late work, Husserl comes closer to acknowledging what Jung had always emphasized, that individual consciousness is situated within a transpersonal, historically evolved field of meaning. There's a poignant passage in Husserl's Crisis where he describes Europe as having a spiritual mission, a vocation to realize universal reason. But this mission is in crisis because European sciences have become merely technical, forgetting their origins in the life world, in the lived meanings that motivated the original quest for knowledge. Husserl calls for a return to these origins, a recovery of the sense of wonder and responsibility that should animate intellectual inquiry. Jung would resonate with this diagnosis of cultural crisis, though he'd describe it differently. Modern Western culture, he believed, had lost connection with the symbolic dimension of life, with myth and ritual, with a religious attitude. People had become one-sidedly rational, identifying entirely with ego consciousness and losing touch with the compensatory wisdom of the unconscious. This was why so many people felt empty despite material success, why neurosis was so widespread. The cure was not more rationality, but recovery of the symbolic life, individuation, integration of conscious and unconscious. Both men, then, saw modernity as a crisis and their work as offering a path forward. For Husserl, the solution was renewed philosophical rigor, a return to phenomenological foundations. For Jung, the solution was psychological and spiritual, a rediscovery of the self through individuation. One looked to clarify consciousness, the other to integrate the unconscious. One emphasized reason, the other emphasized wholeness. But might these be two aspects of the same necessary response to modernity's discontents? Perhaps we need both clarity and integration, both rigorous analysis of consciousness and receptive engagement with the unconscious. Perhaps the future requires a synthesis that neither man alone could provide. As we move into the third movement of our exploration, let us reflect more freely on what this comparison reveals about the nature of human understanding, about the challenge of knowing the psyche, about the tensions between different ways of approaching interiority. There is a kind of vertigo in studying consciousness, whether through Husserl's phenomenology or Jung's depth psychology. You're using consciousness to study consciousness, using the psyche to explore the psyche. The instrument of investigation is also the object of investigation. This creates unique methodological challenges. You cannot step outside consciousness to observe it from a neutral standpoint. You're always already inside the field you're studying. Husserl addressed this through the phenomenological reduction, the move from the natural attitude to the transcendental attitude. By bracketing existence claims and focusing on how things appear, phenomenology creates a kind of reflective distance. You're no longer immersed in the world, but observing how the world is constituted for consciousness, yet you're still using consciousness to perform this observation. The transcendental ego observing consciousness is itself a feature of consciousness. This leads to what Husserl called the paradox of subjectivity. Consciousness is both part of the world and that for which the world appears. Jung approached this paradox differently. He acknowledged that the psyche observing itself creates peculiar difficulties. The unconscious, by definition, cannot directly observe itself. It becomes conscious only by ceasing to be unconscious. Yet Jung felt that the unconscious could be approached indirectly, through its manifestations in dreams, symptoms, and symbols. The analyst interprets these manifestations, but the interpretation is also a psychic event, also arising from consciousness that has its own unconscious dimensions. Jung spoke of the wounded healer, the analyst who must engage with their own unconscious to understand the patients, who must remain aware that they're not a neutral observer but a participant in the psychic field between patient and analyst. Both approaches acknowledge that studying interiority is not like studying external objects. You cannot achieve the kind of detachment that natural science assumes. Subject and object interpenetrate. Observer and observed are entangled. Yet both Husserl and Jung insisted that this doesn't mean rigor is impossible. It means rigor takes a different form. For Husserl, the discipline of careful description and eidetic analysis. For Jung, the discipline of amplification and the analysis of transference and countertransference. There's something almost spiritual in both approaches, though neither man would want their work reduced to spirituality. Husserl saw phenomenology as radical philosophy, not religion or mysticism. Jung carefully distinguished his psychology from metaphysics, insisting that he studied psychic realities empirically without making claims about ultimate truths. Yet both asked practitioners to transform their consciousness, to adopt a new attitude toward experience, to practice a discipline that was as much ethical and existential as intellectual. The phenomenological reduction requires suspending the natural attitude, the ordinary assumption that things simply are as they appear. This suspension is not just an intellectual move, but a shift in how you inhabit the world. You become less attached, more reflective, more aware of the constructed nature of your experience. There's a kind of freedom in this, a lightness that comes from not taking appearances for granted. The Jungian path of individuation requires facing the unconscious, encountering the shadow, withdrawing projections, relating to the self. This, too, is not just intellectual, but existential and ethical. It requires courage, honesty, willingness to be transformed. Jung spoke of individuation as a work, opus in the alchemical sense, a labor that transforms the worker. So both phenomenology and analytical psychology are not just theories, but practices, ways of living, disciplines of attention and transformation. This is part of why they resist easy synthesis. They're not just intellectual positions that could be logically integrated, but forms of life that ask different things of practitioners. Yet for those of us who are neither professional phenomenologists nor training analysts, who encounter these approaches as readers and seekers trying to understand ourselves and the world, perhaps we can learn from both without needing to choose. We can practice phenomenological attention to how things appear, noting the structures of experience without rushing to explain them. And we can practice Jungian reflection on the symbolic meanings of our dreams and life patterns, asking what the unconscious is communicating. These need not contradict. They can enrich each other. When a powerful emotion arises, you might first practice phenomenological observation. How does this emotion appear? What is its qualitative tone? How does it affect your body? Your awareness of time and space, your sense of self and world. Notice without interpreting, describing as precisely as possible. Then you might shift to Jungian inquiry. What does this emotion mean? What complex has been constellated? What is the unconscious trying to communicate? Where in your life story does this pattern appear? Both modes of inquiry illuminate different dimensions of the same experience. Or consider a synchronicity, one of those meaningful coincidences Jung wrote about. Phenomenologically, you might describe the structure of the experience. Two events occurring close in time, causally unrelated but meaningfully related, producing a sense of numinous connection. You describe how the coincidence appears, its impact on consciousness, without trying to explain it causally or metaphysically. Jungian analysis would amplify the symbolic meaning. What does this synchronicity mean in the context of your individuation process? What is being constellated? Both approaches honor the experience without reducing it. There's a teaching. Story about a finger pointing at the moon. The finger is not the moon. If you focus on the finger, you miss what it's pointing toward. But without the finger, you might not notice the moon. Husserl's phenomenology and Jung's analytical psychology are like two different fingers pointing at the same moon. The mystery of human interiority, the vast terrain of subjective experience that Western modernity had ignored or reduced to something else. They point from different angles, using different gestures, but both are trying to direct attention toward what matters. Perhaps the deepest similarity between Husserl and Jung is that both took subjective experience seriously, insisted that it had its own integrity and reality, refused to reduce it to brain states or conditioned behaviors or evolutionary adaptations. This was not obvious in their historical context. The dominant trends were naturalistic, trying to explain consciousness in objective, third-person terms. Both Husserl and Jung insisted on the irreducibility of the first-person perspective, though they understood that perspective differently. For Husserl, the first-person perspective is not just one perspective among others, but the transcendental condition for any perspective. Objectivity itself, the very idea of a world that exists independently of experience, is an achievement of consciousness, a way that consciousness constitutes its objects. You cannot understand objectivity without understanding the subjective processes that make it possible. This is why phenomenology is first philosophy, the foundation for all other knowledge. For Jung, the psyche is the primary reality. Everything we know through psychic experience. Even physical reality is known only as it appears to the psyche. This doesn't mean reality is merely subjective or that external reality doesn't exist. It means that psychic reality has primacy in the order of knowing. The unconscious, with its archetypal patterns and symbolic processes, is just as real as the external world, perhaps more immediately real because it's experienced directly rather than inferred. Both positions privilege interiority, but they do so for different reasons and with different implications. Husserl privileges consciousness to establish secure philosophical foundations. Jung privileges the psyche to restore meaning and wholeness to human life. One is primarily epistemological, the other primarily therapeutic and existential. Yet both challenge the modern assumption that subjective experience is secondary, derivative, something to be explained away rather than explored and honored. In our contemporary context, where neuroscience claims to explain consciousness in terms of brain processes, where cognitive science models the mind as a computational device, the voices of Husserl and Jung remind us of what's lost in such reductions. Husserl would insist that no neuroscientific explanation can replace phenomenological description, that the structures of consciousness have their own reality that cannot be reduced to brain states. Jung would insist that the symbolic dimension, the meaningful patterns of myth and dream, cannot be captured by computational models of information processing. This is not to deny the value of neuroscience or cognitive science. It's to insist that they address different levels of reality, answer different questions. Neuroscience can tell us about the neural correlates of consciousness, the brain processes associated with different mental states. But it cannot replace the first-person description of how those states feel, what they mean, how they're structured phenomenologically. Cognitive science can model information processing, but it cannot capture the numinosity of archetypal experience, the transformative power of individuation. We need multiple levels of description, multiple methodologies, to do justice to the complexity of human being. Husserl's phenomenology and Jung's analytical psychology offered two such levels, each rich and complex in itself, each revealing dimensions of interiority that other methods miss. Let us reflect on the question of meaning, which runs like a thread through everything we've explored. What does it mean to say an experience is meaningful? How does meaning arise? What is the relationship between meaning and consciousness? For Husserl, meaning is a structure of intentionality. Consciousness is always directed toward objects under certain aspects, certain sine or meanings. The same object can be meant differently. A hammer is meant practically as a tool, aesthetically as a form, historically as an artifact of a certain era. The meaning is not a property of the object itself, but a way the object is given to consciousness, a mode of intentional directedness. Husserl developed a complex theory of meaning constitution, showing how meanings are built up through various intentional acts, layered and sedimented into stable structures. For Jung, meaning arises when consciousness connects with unconscious contents, when symbols bridge ego and self. An experience is meaningful when it contributes to individuation, when it serves the telos of wholeness. Meaning is not just a cognitive structure, but an affective reality, a sense that life has purpose and direction. Jung saw meaninglessness as the fundamental modern sickness more than any specific symptom. The underlying cause of neurosis. People came to him feeling empty, purposeless, going through the motions of successful lives, but experiencing no depth or vitality. The cure was finding meaning, usually through connecting with symbolic dimension of experience, through recognizing archetypal patterns in one's life, through the individuation process. These are very different accounts of meaning, yet both agree that meaning is essential to human existence. Husserl's account is more formal and structural. Jung's is more existential and therapeutic. But both insist that meaning cannot be reduced to something else, cannot be explained away as an epiphenomenon of physical processes. Meaning is a basic feature of human reality. There's a paradox in meaning that both men grappled with. Meaning seems both discovered and created. When you understand something, it feels like discovery. Ah, that's what it means. The meaning was already there, waiting to be recognized. Yet, meaning also requires interpretation, an active process of sense-making. You create meaning by connecting, contextualizing, understanding. So, is meaning objective or subjective, given or made? Husserl would say meaning is constituted by consciousness, but not arbitrarily. The structures of meaning constitution are universal and necessary. Given certain acts and contexts, certain meanings are possible and others are not. There's objectivity in the realm of meaning, even though meanings are not physical properties of objects. Jung would say meaning is both discovered and created, and the most profound meanings arise when consciousness and the unconscious collaborate. The unconscious presents symbols, and consciousness must actively engage with them, amplify them, integrate their messages. The meaning is not simply imposed by ego consciousness, nor is it entirely given by the unconscious. It emerges in the dialectical process between conscious and unconscious, in the individuation process. Both accounts suggest that meaning is neither purely objective nor purely subjective, but intersubjective, or better, constituted in the relationship between consciousness and its objects, or between consciousness and the unconscious. Meaning arises in relationship, in the space between. This brings us to the question of healing, which was central to Jung's work, though peripheral to Husserl's. Jung was a physician, a therapist. His psychology was developed to help suffering people. The question driving his work was always, how can this person become whole? Individuation was not just theoretical knowledge, but therapeutic goal. Husserl was a philosopher, concerned with theoretical questions about knowledge and meaning. Yet his phenomenology has therapeutic implications that he sometimes acknowledged. In The Crisis, he speaks of phenomenology as a way to recover meaning in a world that has become merely technical. Phenomenological reflection can free us from the tyranny of the natural attitude, from the illusion that the way things appear is the only way they could be. There's a liberation in recognizing that the world is constituted by consciousness, that other possibilities exist. Some later phenomenologists developed therapeutic applications. Medard Boss and Ludwig Binswanger created existential phenomenological approaches to psychiatry. The contemporary practice of mindfulness, though rooted in Buddhist tradition, shares phenomenology's emphasis on attending to present experience without judgment, noticing how things appear rather than getting lost in conceptual elaboration. These therapeutic developments suggest that phenomenological attention itself can be healing, that learning to observe experience with clarity and acceptance can transform one's relationship to suffering. Jung's therapeutic approach was more explicitly aimed at transformation. He wasn't just helping people adjust to social norms or reduce symptoms. He wanted to facilitate individuation, the development of the whole personality. This often meant encouraging people to become more eccentric, more themselves, even if that meant diverging from social expectations. Healing was not adaptation, but authenticity. The method involved making the unconscious conscious, withdrawing projections, recognizing and integrating the shadow, relating to the anima or animus, and ultimately developing a relationship with the self. This was demanding work, often painful, always challenging. Jung spoke of the crucifixion of the ego, the suffering involved in Rome, surrendering egocentricity to serve the self's demands. But the result was a more complete, more vital life, a personality animated by connection to transpersonal depths. Would Husserl have appreciated Jung's therapeutic goals? It's hard to say. Husserl was deeply committed to rational clarity, to philosophical rigor. Jung's embrace of the irrational, his engagement with alchemy and Gnosticism, his tolerance for paradox, might have seemed like abandoning the standards of rational inquiry. Yet Husserl also knew that philosophy should serve human flourishing, that theoretical insight should illuminate how to live. In that sense, he might have respected Jung's therapeutic commitment, even if he questioned the methods. Let us consider a concrete example to see how these two approaches might work in practice. Imagine a woman who has recurrent dreams of being chased by a dark figure. She wakes in terror, feeling that something is pursuing her, though she doesn't know what. A phenomenological approach would begin by carefully describing the dream experience. What is the structure of being chased in a dream? How does the chaser appear? Is it a definite figure or an unclear presence? How does space function in the dream, the distance between chaser and chased? What is the quality of the fear? How does the dream ego experience its own agency and vulnerability? Notice that this description brackets questions about what the dream means or what caused it. It simply describes the structure of the experience as precisely as possible. This kind of careful description might already be therapeutic in a subtle way. By describing the experience precisely, the dreamer gains some distance from it, some perspective. The terror becomes an object of awareness rather than something that simply overwhelms. the structure becomes visible, and with structure comes a kind of understanding, even without interpretation. A Jungian approach would ask about the dream's meaning. The dark pursuing figure would likely be understood as the shadow, the disowned parts of the dreamer's personality. Jung would explore what qualities or impulses the dreamer has repressed or denied, what aspects of herself she finds unacceptable. The pursuit represents the shadow's attempt to be recognized and integrated. Running away in the dream corresponds to the ego's refusal to acknowledge these disowned parts. Healing would involve stopping the flight, turning to face the shadow, asking what it wants, eventually integrating its energy and qualities into consciousness. Jung might amplify the image of the dark pursuer with parallels from mythology. The pursuing Erinyes or Furies in Greek myth, representing vengeance for crimes against blood relations, suggesting family complexes. The Black Madonna, the dark feminine that holds rejected aspects of spirituality. Indigenous traditions, shadow animals, representing animal nature that must be acknowledged. Through amplification, the image is situated in a larger symbolic context that helps reveal its meaning. Both approaches honor the dream, but differently. Phenomenology honors it by describing its structure with care and precision. Jungian analysis honors it by taking seriously its symbolic communication, its message from the unconscious. Both could be valuable. The phenomenological description might help the dreamer observe the fear rather than being overwhelmed by it. The Jungian interpretation might help her understand what needs to change in her life, what she needs to face and integrate. Perhaps the ideal would be to do both. First, describe carefully, then interpret symbolically. First, establish clarity about the experience itself, then explore what it means. This sequential approach might avoid the pitfall of rushing to interpretation without fully attending to the phenomenon, while also not stopping at description when interpretation could deepen understanding. Or perhaps the two approaches could be held simultaneously, like binocular vision, creating depth perception. One eye sees the structure, the other sees the meaning, and together they reveal something richer than either alone. This would require unusual flexibility of mind, the ability to shift between different modes of attention, but it might be exactly what's needed for full psychological understanding. As we near the end of our exploration, certain questions remain. Questions that neither Husserl nor Jung fully answered, but that their work helps us articulate more clearly. What is the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious? Are they separate domains or aspects of a unified psyche? Jung believed the unconscious was real and autonomous, possessing its own intelligence and purposes. Husserl's phenomenology has no place for the unconscious in Jung's sense, focusing entirely on what appears to consciousness. Yet, Husserl's late work on passive synthesis and the life world acknowledges that consciousness is always already shaped by structures we don't actively constitute, by meanings we inherit and take for granted. Perhaps these passive, pre-reflective dimensions of consciousness are not so different from what Jung called the unconscious, at least in some aspects. What is the self? Husserl's transcendental ego is a formal structure, the pure I that accompanies all experiences. Jung's self is a substantive center, the archetype of wholeness that guides individuation. The transcendental ego has no content, no personality. It's just the form of subjectivity as such. The self is full of content, manifesting in symbols of totality, mandalas, divine images. These seem completely different, yet both point to something that transcends the empirical personality, something that makes experience possible or directs personal development from a deeper wisdom. How should we understand universality in human experience? Husserl's essences and Jung's archetypes both claim universal validity, but in different ways. Essences are discovered through rational intuition and are necessary structures. Archetypes are discovered through empirical comparison and are powerful patterns. Can these be reconciled? Perhaps essences describe the formal structures of how things can appear, while archetypes describe the powerful patterns of meaning that humans universally discover. Structure and content, form and meaning, both universal but in different senses. What is the relationship between clarity and mystery? Husserl pursued clarity with relentless determination, believing that rigorous analysis could dissolve confusion and achieve certainty. Jung embraced mystery, feeling that the psyche's depths exceeded rational comprehension, that wholeness required accepting paradox and unknowing. These seem opposed, but perhaps both are necessary. We need clarity about what we can clearly understand and humility before what exceeds understanding. The mistake is thinking everything should be clear or that everything is mysterious. Different domains require different attitudes. How should we relate to tradition? Husserl wanted philosophy to return to its roots in radical questioning, to establish itself on new, secure foundations. Jung wanted to recover wisdom from traditional sources, alchemy, Gnosticism, mythology, translating it into modern terms. Both were responding to modernity's break with tradition, but in opposite ways. One by radically renewing philosophy, the other by retrieving forgotten knowledge. Perhaps we need both. Critical renewal that examines everything afresh, and respectful retrieval that recovers what modernity too hastily discarded. What is the goal of psychological or philosophical inquiry? For Husserl, it was theoretical knowledge, understanding the structures of consciousness and the foundations of meaning. For Jung, it was practical transformation, individuation, wholeness, theory and practice, knowledge and life. Both are valuable, and perhaps the deepest understanding comes when they unite, when theoretical insight illuminates practice and practice validates theory. These questions don't have final answers. They're the kind of questions that each generation must engage afresh, bringing new perspectives and experiences. Husserl and Jung have given us powerful tools for this engagement, two different maps of interior territory. As you drift towards sleep now, let these ideas settle into your mind without strain. You don't need to remember everything, to hold it all clearly. Let it become part of the background, the life world of your own consciousness, shaping how you experience without requiring explicit awareness. Consider your own dreams tonight. If you remember them when you wake, you might try both approaches. First, describe carefully. How did the dream appear? What was its structure, its atmosphere, its logic? Then ask, what might it mean? What is the unconscious communicating? Both kinds of attention honor the dream, revealing different dimensions. Consider your waking experience too. Sometimes practice phenomenological attention. Observe how things appear. Notice the structures of perception, feeling, thinking, without rushing to judge or explain. Other times, practice Jungian reflection. Ask what patterns are manifesting in your life, what archetypes are constellated, what your symptoms and synchronicities might mean. Both practices can deepen self-understanding. The dialogue between Husserl and Jung continues in those who engage seriously with both traditions, who refuse to choose between clarity and depth, between structure and meaning, between description and interpretation. Perhaps you will be part of that dialogue, bringing your own experience and insight to this ongoing conversation about the nature of consciousness and the psyche. Both men devoted their lives to understanding human interiority, believing it was the most important and most neglected dimension of reality. In an age still dominated by objectivistic science and technological thinking, their insistence on the primacy of subjective experience remains vital. We need phenomenological rigor to resist the reduction of consciousness to brain states. We need Jungian depth to resist the reduction of the psyche to information processing. We need both to maintain space for the full reality of human experience. Husserl died in 1938 as Europe descended into darkness. His manuscripts were smuggled out of Germany by a Franciscan priest and eventually deposited in Leuven, Belgium, where they remain tens of thousands of pages in shorthand, still being transcribed and published. His influence spread through continental philosophy, shaping existentialism, hermeneutics, post-structuralism, though often in ways that departed from his original vision. Jung died in 1961, having lived long enough to see his psychology gain widespread recognition. He left behind a vast body of writing, difficult and elusive, full of images and symbols, inspiring generations of analysts and seekers. His influence extended beyond psychology to comparative religion, mythology, literature, even popular culture, though often in simplified or distorted forms. Both men's legacies are contested. Husserl's phenomenology is sometimes seen as overly focused on consciousness at the expense of embodiment, language, and social context. Jung's psychology is sometimes dismissed as mystical, unscientific, prone to stereotyping. But serious engagement with their actual writings reveals thinkers of profound depth and nuance, genuinely grappling with the challenge of understanding human interiority. We might think of them as standing on opposite shores of a river, the river of human experience flowing between them. Husserl on one shore, observing with philosophical precision how the water moves, what structures define its flow, what formal features make it a river at all. Jung on the other shore, diving beneath the surface, exploring the depths, discovering what lives in those depths, what symbolic meanings the river carries, both needed, neither sufficient alone. Together, they map a territory larger than either could chart individually. The river flows on, carrying us all. We are the river and the observers of the river, consciousness, studying consciousness, the psyche, exploring the psyche, this strange reflexivity, this loop of awareness, aware of itself, is the source of both endless fascination and perpetual difficulty. We cannot step outside to see the whole because we are always already inside, looking out through eyes that are part of what they observe. Yet within this limitation, vast exploration is possible. Husserl showed that consciousness has structures we can describe with rigor and precision. Jung showed that the psyche has depths we can engage with courage and imagination. Both invitations remain open. The phenomenological attitude is always available. Pause, reflect, notice how things appear, describe, without assumption. The Jungian attitude is always available. Attend to dreams, honor symbols, ask about meaning, trust the unconscious's wisdom. Perhaps the ultimate similarity between them is that both believed human beings could know themselves more deeply, that such knowledge was worthwhile, that the examined interior life was worth living. In a world that constantly directs attention outward, toward productivity and consumption, toward screens and noise. This shared commitment to interiority is quietly radical. In the silence of your room now, as sleep approaches, you are practicing both phenomenology and depth psychology without needing to name them. You are aware of awareness itself, noticing how thoughts arise and fade, how the boundary between waking and sleeping blurs, how consciousness gradually releases its hold, and you are allowing the unconscious to prepare its nightly offerings, the dreams that will come bearing messages, images, questions, surprises. Neither Husserl nor Jung would have you worry about methodology as you fall asleep. The discipline, the analysis, the careful distinctions, those come later in waking reflection. For now, simply be conscious, simply be psyche, the living unity that exceeds all our theories and categories. Let Husserl's voice remind you, attend to the phenomena, let things show themselves as they are. Trust that clarity is possible through patient observation. Let Jung's voice remind you, honor the depths, trust the unconscious's wisdom. Know that wholeness emerges through integrating darkness and light. Both voices are speaking an ancient truth, older than either man's particular formulation, that human beings are strange and wonderful, that consciousness is a mystery worth investigating, that the psyche contains depths beyond rational understanding, yet not beyond relationship and engagement, that self-knowledge is both possible and necessary, that the inner life deserves the same careful attention we give to the outer world. As you slip into sleep, carrying these ideas like seeds that will germinate in darkness, know that you are participating in a tradition of introspection that stretches back beyond Husserl and Jung, back through the phenomenologists and depth psychologists, back through the mystics and philosophers, back to whoever first turned awareness back upon itself and wondered, what am I? What is this consciousness that asks such questions? What depths lie beneath the surface of my awareness? These questions have no final answers because they are alive, evolving as consciousness itself evolves. Each person who seriously engages them adds something, shifts the understanding slightly, opens new possibilities. Your own experience, reflected upon with honesty and care, whether phenomenologically or psychologically or in some synthesis yet to be articulated, is part of this ongoing exploration. Husserl and Jung, for all their differences, both knew this, that individual consciousness is not isolated but participates in something larger, whether that's the universal structures of transcendental subjectivity or the collective patterns of the archetypal unconscious. When you examine your own experience deeply, you discover not just personal particularity, but universal structures and patterns. The personal and the universal meet in the disciplined attention to one's own being. So rest now, release from effort, drifting between the shores Husserl and Jung mapped. Let consciousness gradually dissolve into sleep, that nightly death and rebirth that reminds us we are not in control, that the ego is not the center, that something larger sustains us. Let the unconscious rise with its dreams and images, speaking its symbolic language, offering compensations and insights that consciousness alone could not produce. Tomorrow you will wake, and the dialogue will continue. You will perceive, and the phenomenologist in. You will notice how perception structures appearance. You will feel and remember and imagine, and the structures of these acts will be available for description. You will also dream and wonder and find meaning, and the depth psychologist in you will ask what patterns are emerging, what archetypes are active, what the symptoms and synchronicities might signify. Both modes of attention are gifts bequeathed by these two great explorers of interiority. Both are paths into the mystery that you are, that each human being is. Neither exhausts that mystery, but both illuminate it, create clearings where understanding can dawn. Welcome the sleep that comes now as a phenomenological reduction of its own kind, a bracketing of the natural attitude so complete that the world itself is suspended. Welcome it also as a descent into the unconscious, a nightly return to the source, a dissolution that prepares for tomorrow's renewal. The conversation between Husserl and Jung continues in the space. Between waking and sleeping, between clarity and mystery, between structure and meaning, it continues in you as you navigate the complex terrain of being human, being conscious, being psyche. May you find both clarity and depth, both understanding and wonder, both the phenomenologist's precision and the psychologist's wisdom for symbolic dimensions. May you know yourself as consciousness and as more than consciousness, as ego and as self, as individual and as participant in something universal. The river flows, the dialogue continues. Sleep now, wanderer of interior worlds, and dream.